Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Bradley Wolfe, and I'm going over Chapter 2 in the textbook Communication in the Real World. This chapter is about communication and perception. And I'm using the textbook version by James Madison University. So they're the one hosting this version, as there are different versions of this open education resource out there. So this talks about perception, how perception is related to communication. So it defines perception as the process of selecting, organizing, and interpreting information. So it has a little graph here: selection, organization, interpretation. So the selection process is the first part of that. So it's what information are we taking in to move on to that organization stage. We use all five senses to take in information. So it's not just the words we hear, could be something we smell, could be something that we're tasting, could be something that we see, like the clothes someone's wearing can help us interpret a message or impact how we interpret the message. So it's this first part of the process. What's relevant? Is this relevant information that's going to impact how we see everything else going on around it? One of the parts of that selection process is salience. So salience is the degree to which something attracts our attention in a particular context. So for example, I often will I drive a Mitsubishi Mirage. So if I see other Mitsubishi Mirages on the road, that's going to attract my attention, right? That's going to be very salient for me because it's something I'm familiar with. If you like art, you may notice the art behind me on the wall here. So you may pay more attention to those colors or patterns or whatever it may be. If you like animals, you may notice animals out when you're going on a walk in nature more than other parts of that. So it's whatever is attracting our attention that we're deciding, that we're selecting. It could be consciously, it could be unconsciously selecting the information to take in and to organize it in some way. So another part of that selection process is how focused we are. So right now you're listening to a textbook lecture. If you're scrolling on your phone at the same time, checking your emails while this is playing in the background, you may not be as focused. You're selecting to focus on something else, right? So we have some control over the information that we're selecting in terms of our perception process and how we're perceiving the situation. Sometimes if people are in disagreements or in conflict, they may have selected at the initial stage of the perception process to focus on different things. And now they're like, oh, I understood this differently from you, right? That can cause an argument. It can cause conflict because you both may have had the same conversation together, witnessed the same thing, whatever it may be, but you may have focused on you selected different information in that perception process and had a different interpretation of events. We're going to get to that interpretation, but first we got to go to the organization. Oh, actually, we have a little bit more on the salience here. So what sort of stuff do we select? So it talks about visual and or I have a speech impediment, so this is the R stuff for me, oral stimulation. So anything that is visual or that we hear is going to stimulate things in our attention span. So if you hear a loud noise, if you see something that you weren't expecting, if you see something that you were expecting, you are looking for, all these things can impact how we're perceiving. So whatever's stimulating our attention at the moment. We also have needs and interests. So if we're hungry, we may be paying more attention to restaurants in the area if we're going around. That may be a need of ours to get our hunger need met. You may be interested in specific things. Some people are interested in art. You may see an art supply store and that may stand out to you. It talks about speaking to a financial aid officer at your school about scholarships and loans. You may be paying close attention to that information. Talks about waiting in the lobby. You're going to pay close attention to your name being called. Then when you're in a conversation with a person, you're going to focus on that, saying, "Hey, I really need a scholarship. I don't know if I'm going to pay for college." So that's part of your needs and interests as well. What are you focused on in that conversation? So again, that may make it more salient. We also may have expectations. So it could be the expectations are being met. So that's what we're focusing on. It could be the expectations are not being met. And that's so we focus on that because something surprised us. So that may draw us in and make us pay more attention when something's a little bit different. So it talks about if you're in a classroom and there was someone dressed up as a wizard, you'd probably notice because that's different, right? That didn't meet your expectations of what people would be wearing in that classroom environment. So again, variety of things, other things like our expectations sometimes, when you're leaving the house, you lock the door, get in your car and go to wherever you need to go. And like, oh, did I lock my door? Sometimes it's just so in the back of your mind that you don't remember it. So it's like, oh, I didn't select that information to remember and perceive. So now I'm worried that my house is unlocked. So that can also be about the perception process and what's salient. But after you select the information, so you select the information, a lot of different reasons information is selected, both conscious and unconscious, then we go on to the organization. So organization is the second part of the perception process. And here's where we're sorting and categorizing the information based on the patterns, cognitive patterns that we've developed over time. So there's different ways which we can sort things. It talks here about we sort it by proximity, by similarity, by difference. So proximity, things that are close together, go together in your mind. So you want to kind of collect those things. So maybe physically near each other, could be. There's some examples here. So it talks about like if you're a clerk and you're trying to determine if someone's in a group or someone's separated, maybe how close they're standing together. The next part about similarity, so we can organize based on similar. So it could be similar looking, similar acting, things that we're grouping them together. And we can, again, the opposite of the similarities and difference as well. So difference, okay, these things don't look like each other. They don't act like each other. So we're putting them in different categories as well. So there's a lot of ways that we organize information. And as we start to understand something more, we may organize into more specific categories. So this is when you start when you're a child in elementary school, you may, all these numbers, math. Okay, that's starting to learn numbers. Numbers and letters may be similar when you're like in kindergarten. But then you sort, okay, this is more letters and words. This is numbers. So I'm going to separate them, and I'm going to organize more specifically than math. Okay, plus, minus, division, multiplication. Oh, they're all signs, right? If you don't know the difference between them, you may put them all together, but then you start separating them and organizing them in a different way and understanding, right? Perceiving the numbers in a different way. So just using a quick math example there. You're going to organize information. Happens all the time, often on an unconscious level, just as we develop and have different ways that we have learned to categorize it. So last year in the perception process is interpreting. So like I talked in some depth about the selecting and organizing process, you can learn a lot more about that if you're really interested in it, but it actually happens very quickly. Often we go straight to this interpreting step that we don't even pay attention to the fact that we're selecting or organizing the information. We're just interpreting and making understanding of it. If this one's out of these three steps, it's much more deliberate and a conscious step in the perception process. So we're assigning meaning to our experiences using mental structures known as schemata. So schemata are like databases of stored relevant information that we use to interpret new information. So it gets fairly complicated in how we're, having these different schemata in terms of interpreting the information. So it talks about the example here, talking about interpreting experiences with teachers and classmates. We start learning how to interact with people. So communication, right? If we're looking at the communication perception process and interpret communication, if something is said to us by a boss, a supervisor, a teacher, someone in a position of power, authority, maybe a parent even, is going to be interpreted differently than if it's that information is from a peer. Based on that association we have and have developed over time, that the relationship we have with people impacts how we perceive the communication taking place. So we're going to interpret it differently at this stage. So that's one example. It also, it talks here also about if you're doing a group project and you perceive someone as shy, you may start communicating the way, oh, how do shy people communicate with me? And you may expect that. And then if they just start, ranting and raving about something, it's like, oh, maybe this person isn't shy. Now I need to change how I'm interpreting it based on this new information that I have. So it continues to change how we interpret things based on new information that we're getting. So that's a bit about the process. But again, if I go back up here to the graph, there's the selection, there's organization, and then interpretation. Those are the three steps of the perception process. It's the main thing to know from that section of the text. So 2.2, perceiving others. So how are we judging other people? We judge everyone, right, based on information that we have. We're interpreting them in some way. We may judge them positively. We may judge them neutrally. Like, hey, that's just a person, right? That's a judgment as well, to go along with it. And these judgments can happen very quickly. So it says 100 milliseconds of exposure to a politician's face, we can make judgments about them. Very short information. They've done one with teachers in a classroom where they have teachers, they just give a snippet of the teachers in the classroom, just their voice, like a 5-second clip. and they evaluate them. How good of teacher is this person? And then they compared those 5-second clips, the evaluations based on the 5-second clips to the end of semester evaluations, and they're pretty similar, right? So we make very, very quick judgments based on people. Is this judgment right or wrong, right? Certainly there can be wrong judgments that we make. And as we get to know people, we can challenge the information that we have on them, and perceive them in a different way. So it talks about attribution and interpretation as well, here. So we're using our existing perceptions of people, to, could reinforce through that conversation saying, oh yeah, I hate that person. Look, and whatever they say, we're interpreting that through their filter. So we can find things wrong with what other people are saying and get mad about it. Or if we like someone, we're more likely to agree with them. Even if the person we dislike and like are saying the same thing, we may agree with the person we like and disagree with the person we dislike based on that prior knowledge, right? That prior experience with them. We're interpreting what they're saying through that experience. So it talks about in interactions how we run an attribution script in our mind. So we're trying to come up with explanations for what happened. So why did my neighbor slam the door when she saw me walking down the hall? Why is my partner being extra nice to me today? Why did my office mate miss our team project meeting this morning? So we're trying to attribute the cause of others' behaviors to either internal or external factors. So internal attributions connect the cause of the behaviors to aspects such as personality traits, whereas external is connected to the cause of the behaviors to situational factors, things outside their control. So if we like someone, right, and they're doing something positive, we're more likely to interpret that as based on something internal, right? Oh, they're a good person, that's why they did this. Whereas we dislike someone, we may take something that's, if they're doing something good, we may say, hey, what's going on here? We may be more suspicious of it. So often for ourselves, if we do something good, most people think highly of themselves or to some degree. So if we're doing something nice, it's because I'm a good person. And if we mess up, we make a mistake. It's external factors, right? That was outside of my control. You made me do this. I didn't have any other choice but to do this, right? It's external factors if we're doing something negative. So based on how we like someone or dislike them, or as we're getting to know people, we may be more likely to pick either an internal or an external factor based on the relationship that we have with them. And again, if we're getting to know someone, based on how we're interpreting that information, we may start liking them or disliking them or viewing them in a different way based on the attribution. So it talks about one of the most common perceptual errors is the fundamental attribution error, which refers to our tendency to explain others' behavior using internal rather than external attributions. So it gives an example about parking wars where, again, are we blaming someone, right, with that internal? Are we causing it, because they're bad, because they're good, instead of looking at the whole situation? So sometimes with that perception, again, we're selecting information. We just select to focus on that person and their internal attributes, and not for, zooming out to focus on the situation and select that part of information. And we may not know the other information that may be causing someone to act. If they had a bad day and they come home and they're crabby with us, it's like, why are you being crabby with me, right? We don't know that they had a bad day. We don't know that context. So we're interpreting as internal. Oh, you're an angry person. You're getting mad at me. Instead of external, they've been in a very frustrating situation and we just happen to come across them. Or it gave the example earlier of the neighbor slamming the door when you walk up by them in the apartment. Maybe it was like they were carrying things or trying to get the door shut and you move on. And you may think, why are they slamming the door in my face? Right. So we may interpret that in a very different way. It also talks about the self-serving bias, which is a perceptual error, which we attribute the cause of our successes to internal personal factors while attributing the failures to external factors beyond our control. I mentioned that a bit earlier as well. So that's called the self-serving bias. So if we look at the fundamental attribution error and the self-serving bias together, we can see that we're more likely to judge ourselves more favorably than another person, or at least less personally. So again, that's an important thing when we're looking at the perception and attribution. That's an important thing to take into account. There's also the physical and environmental influences on perception. So based on, what's going on. So it talks about if people are dressing appropriately for the situation. I try to wear a collared shirt when I teach because that's more professional than a shirt without a collar. And it can impact on how people perceive me. I remember once I was teaching, this was several years ago, but I was I was sick that day, but this was before COVID too. So people weren't as worried about going to work sick, but I was not feeling well. I had kind of a stomach flu. So I went in, but I was not dressed well. I'm just like, I just want to get in. I want to get this done. And, I didn't want to have to cancel class because I was, still temporary teacher, and I didn't want to look bad by canceling class, but I wasn't dressed very well. And one of the students said, "Oh, I'm glad you're finally comfortable with us. You can wear sweatpants to school." And I'm just like, I'm not feeling well. I'm just trying to get through this day. But again, those what we're wearing, that those physical factors impact how we see somebody else. So we're looking at how they're dressed and interpreting that as part of the process. We also look at stereotypes. We can look at someone's physical features such as race is often something that we can see. The gender is often something that's going to be more of a physical feature. So, you know, how we present ourselves in those way we interpret things. We interact with people differently, and may interpret things differently based on unconscious bias. Right? So again, not necessarily us doing something. Oh, I don't like people of this certain group. I don't like people of this certain background, but it may just be an unconscious bias based on stereotypes in our society. So those can impact our perception as well. So we need to make sure we're challenging our perception and how we're interpreting things. Right? It might be fair in how I'm interpreting this and how I'm thinking about something. Next is culture, personality, and perception. So our cultural identities impact our perception as well. So it talks about culture. So again, race, gender, sexual orientation, class, nationality, age, all affect the perceptions that we make. So our cultural identities influence the schemata through which we interpret what we perceive. Um, so I am a white man, so I'm going to interpret things based on, that's going to impact how I interpret things. Very simply, people who may have different experiences than I do, and I'm going to interpret things differently. They're going to interpret things differently than I do based on our experiences that we've had, with communication, with culture, with community, and exposing ourselves to those cultural differences and perception may help us understand ourselves better. I once went to a Native American reservation, the Northern Cheyenne Nation. I did a week-long service trip there, and so one of the things talks about this in terms of culture is monochronic time versus polychronic time. Monochronic time, we have a schedule. That's how I was raised. Very European American. We have a schedule. Things are due at this time. I'm supposed to be in class from 2 to 3 o'clock, so I'm going to be there. I'm not going to end my presentation late. I'm going to start on time. Right? That's monochronic time. Polychronic time, which is in a lot of subcultures in the United States and certainly in other cultures around the world. Many Native American communities use more polychronic time. I've also heard it referred to as res time, very lovingly by Native Americans. They call it res time. But it's, it doesn't matter when things start or end. You're just in the moment, right? And that's one of the good things about it. You're really in the moment. You're appreciating what you're doing here and now. You're not worried about what you have to do or what else gets done or what else needs to get done. You're just kind of in there with the other person. And so these two can clash. So I was there. I was at this Native American reservation, and we were there to move their Boys and Girls Club, all the supplies from one location to another. We show up the first day. We're waiting there for like a couple of hours, and we're like, "Come on, the door's locked. Can't do anything. I'm only there for a week. Why aren't you letting me in? Right? Why aren't you letting our group in? This is so frustrating. Right? It's irresponsible." That's again my cultural background. Polychronic time. They knew it was going to get moved. It didn't matter if it got moved today or tomorrow. Right? They knew it was going to get moved. So they weren't worried about it. They were worried about, paying attention to the people they were with at that moment and giving them their full and undivided attention. The next day we came back, we got everything moved. It wasn't a problem. We got everything set up, right? It wasn't a huge deal. So it's nothing that, I needed to stress about. They weren't stressed about it. I didn't need to stress about it either because it was going to get done. But it's just those differences in culture impact how we perceive something. So I may view someone, as being lazy and irresponsible in that moment. But once I got myself checked, and got pushed back on my culture, and the person leading our trip was very, he was Native American. He was able to explain what was going on. And I'm like, oh, now that makes sense. Now I can appreciate that point of view. And now I understand myself better, right? It's not telling me that I have to change and be, polychronic time, but it's helping me understand myself better and expectations. Because sometimes we take our own expectations, our own culture for granted. Like, this is the way I was raised. This is the way I've learned to do things. So that's the expectation I have for everyone else, whereas other people have different cultural differences that need to be taken into account as well. So we look at personality as another part of perception. So I'm very much an introvert, very strong introvert. So sometimes people say, "Hey, Bradley, you're so unfriendly, right? Why aren't you talking to me?" It's like I'm sitting here, I'm listening. I feel like I'm part of the conversation. I just don't feel a need to talk all the time, right? I'm very content just sitting there and listening to somebody else. Um, and so often I can be good friends with extroverts because extroverts sometimes like talking, talking, talking. My best friend's a very strong extrovert. So she talks a lot, but then she realizes, okay, I need to shut up and ask Bradley about himself because he's just going to let me keep on talking. And she wants to, going to have that two-way conversation. So figuring out her own norms and not judging other people for being different can be very important as well. But yeah, there's certainly personality differences. Talks about the big five personality traits here. So one of those is introversion, extroversion. You can see extroverts. Uh, why do they get the E? I want introverts to have the I. Um, but it is extroversion is the scale. So you're either high extroversion, low extroversion. So if you're low extroversion, you're an introvert. So I'm very strong introvert. We have agreeableness. So refers to the person's level of trustworthiness and friendliness. So people with high agreeableness are cooperative and likable. Again, this is a little bit biased in how they're framing this. I have higher agreeableness, so I'd love to say that I'm likable, right? The people who have lower agreeableness are suspicious of others and sometimes aggressive. So I think it says it makes it more difficult for people to find them pleasant to be with. I think agreeableness for me is understanding other people's perspectives and saying, I can see why you think that way, right? I take the time to listen and I agree with them. I don't necessarily have the same belief as somebody else. But I can understand why other people have beliefs that are different than my own, and I'm agreeable in that way. So I'm being friendly. But I've also I'm Minnesota nice sometimes. So agreeableness can also be seen as, but especially people with lower agreeableness can be seen as disingenuous or, because again, if I'm like nodding along and being agreeable with somebody when they're saying something I disagree with, and I'm just saying yes, I understand where you're coming from, and they may interpret it, right? Perception, they may interpret it as that I have the same belief as them, or I stand with them in that, right? It's like, well, you were agreeing with me. It's like I was agreeing that I understood where you were coming from. I didn't agree that you were right. So maybe less willing to engage in that conflict as well, having high agreeableness. So I'm actually not that yeah, unwilling to engage in conflict. I'm willing to engage with conflict with people, but I don't like seek out conflict, right? Someone with low agreeableness may be more interested in having that conflict and having those, conversations with some tension in them. Whereas I'm like, this doesn't really matter to me that much, so I'm not going to have a fight over it. But if it is something that's important to me, I certainly can engage in that conflict in an appropriate way, right? Conflict's not a bad thing, right? Conflict's not necessarily a bad thing, I should say. We might get to conflict in a later chapter, but just uh, again, a little bit of a tangent there, adding more to this material. Again, that's what I think these lectures should be, not just repeating what's in the textbook, but adding to it. So conscientiousness refers to a person's self-organization and motivation. So if you're high conscientious, you're very methodical, motivated, dependable. Low conscientious or less focused, careful, or dependable. And again, it's making it sound like the highs the positive and the lows the not negative, and that's not the case. Certainly, you can have low conscientiousness but still be a very good person. So I don't like the way that this textbook's framing this terminology here. But yeah, conscientiousness, you're very organized. You want things to be a certain way. Uh, my best friend and her husband's very high conscientiousness, very organized, wants to be polite with people. And my friend, she is, less focused. She has ADHD, right? It's just ADHD and conscientiousness don't go well together. So she's less focused, but she's very fun. She may be late to things. So again, that's part of conscientiousness too. But she's still dependable. So again, how we're interpreting these. And so again, that's perception. How do we interpret something and how do we say what we're interpreting? Even a textbook has some bias in how it's framing things. Neuroticism refers to a person's level of negative thoughts about him or herself, or themselves too. We want to be inclusive. That should be updated here. I wrote the textbook. People high in neuroticism are insecure, experience emotional distress, and may be perceived as unstable. People with low neuroticism are more relaxed, less likely to have emotional swings, and perceived as more stable. So again, the high one here is actually the negative one, but again, it's viewing them as negative and positive instead of just saying traits, right? Being more neutral, which is how I would perceive each of these as more neutral continuum. And then openness refers to a person's willingness to consider new ideas and perspectives. People high in openness are creative and perceived as open-minded. People low in openness are more rigid, set in their thinking, and perceived as set in their ways, which isn't a bad thing. If you, I think of in terms of food for myself. I'm not, I don't know where I am on that scale, but in food, like I know what I like and I like what I don't, right? I'm very, plain eater. But other people are much more adventurous. So that's something to take into consideration as well. But openness is a person's willingness to consider new ideas and perspectives. So again, those are the big 5 personality traits. I think they are framed in a bit of biased way in this textbook, but it's something important to keep into account. That those traits do exist and they're in continuums for each of our personality and identity. It's one way of looking at it. So 2.3, perceiving and presenting self. So last section, we were focusing on others. Now we're focusing on ourselves. So self-concept refers to the overall idea of who a person thinks they are. So if someone asks you, tell me who you are, your answers can be part of your self-concept. Sharing about yourself, how you view yourself. It talks here about the concept of the looking glass self, explains that we see ourselves reflected in people's reactions to us. And then form our self-concept based on how we believe other people see us. So again, is my concept of myself, my self-concept, more accurate than someone who knows me really well, how they view me? Those probably aren't the same, right? How we view ourselves and how each other person views us. They probably know different versions of Bradley. I have my version of Bradley, and each person I interact with has their version of Bradley as well, based on their experience interacting with us and how they view things and how they view the world. It's going to change things. Each of us has our own bias. Talked earlier, we often have more of a positive bias towards ourselves. The good things we do are based on internal, that self-serving bias. Good things are based on internal factors. Bad things that happen to us are based on external factors. But yeah, some people have a low self-concept too. So you can have a high self-concept or a low self-concept. I think this talks about self-esteem here. Yeah, self-esteem down here. I'm going to go to this one next. So self-concepts is kind of who you are. Self-esteem refers to the judgments and evaluations we make about our self-concept. So it's more about, labeling the things as good, bad, positive, negative, desirable, undesirable. Often people have a high self-concept and a high self-esteem, right? Those often will go together. We view ourselves as very good, capable, competent, and we view ourselves positively, right? So positive, positive, or negative, negative, where you say, hey, I'm a bad person, I mess everything up, just very unlucky, and our self-esteem's low, right? We don't like ourselves or other things, right? So often the self-concept and self-esteem is the same. It doesn't have to be the same though. For example, you could feel have very positive things about your self-concept, that you're, very smart, capable, competent in many ways, and feel good about that, good about who you are. But your self-esteem could be low because those good traits aren't fitting in or finding their place, or so you may think, hey, I wish I was different, right? I don't really like myself, even though I think I do things well, right? So just an example. It talks about how we develop our self-concept through comparisons to other people. So social comparison theory states that we describe and evaluate ourselves in terms of how we compare to other people. So there's 2 dimensions. So the superiority, inferiority dimension, and similarity difference dimension. So we may view ourselves as better or worse than other people around us in terms of attractiveness, intelligence, athletic ability, so on, whatever it may be. And we may view ourselves as more similar or different to other people. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but just reference groups. Where do I fit in? So that impacts in the social comparison theory, that would impact our self-concept. So yeah, that's a bit about the self-concept and self-esteem. It talks here about improving perception as well. So what do we do with this, right? This is how we perceive things, but how do we improve our perception? To be more aware of the schema that we use, the socializing forces, self-fulfilling processes, negative patterns of thinking. These different things can impact how we perceive things, and there are things we can work on, right? We have some control over our perception process. So our perceptions can and do change. We have an overall self-concept and self-esteem that's relatively stable, but we also have context-specific self-perception. So you may have a good self-concept overall, but maybe in this one workplace, in this one friendship group, you may say, hey, I'm not very competent here. I don't feel very competent. It could be one class in school. Hey, I'm great overall. I'm a pretty good student, but I'm just bad at math. Right? Some people say they're bad at math. I don't think anyone's just naturally bad at math, but sometimes that would be a whole tangent, but I don't think anyone's bad at math. I just think people are more experienced or less experienced with math, and getting the opportunity to learn those basic concepts would be helpful. So self-concept and self-esteem are very subjective and very personal. So it's inaccurate to say that someone's self-concept is right or wrong, but we can look at some negative and positive aspects of self-concept and discuss common barriers to forming an accurate and positive self-perception. So often if we have a negative self-perception, we may want to work on that, right? You don't necessarily want to go through life thinking negatively about yourself. So certainly therapy can help you with that, going to talk to somebody, or doing things to challenge our negative self-perception, saying, hey, I'm not very good at math. Let me get an A in this math class. I'm going to work really hard and say, hey, yes, I can do this, right? So do things to challenge our perception as well. So that's how you can improve it. Other ways you can improve it is to avoid reliance on rigid schema. So the schemata are sets of information based on cognitive and experiential knowledge that guide our interaction. Sometimes we have, very rigid to fit things together when we're organizing the information and interpreting it. But sometimes we can take a step back and say, hey, what if I'm wrong at this? What if I'm perceiving this in the wrong way? What are other ways of looking at the same situation? That can sometimes help us get a more accurate perception and improve our perception of self and a perception of others as well, especially when there are cultural differences and you say, hey, maybe I should not judge this person based on my cultural schemata. Maybe I should look at what are some other ways of viewing the same situation. It also says to be aware of the self-fulfilling prophecy. So it's thoughts and action patterns in which a person's false belief triggers a behavior that makes the initial false belief actual or seemingly come true. So it says, for example, a student's biology lab instructor is a Chinese person who speaks English as a second language. The student falsely believes the instructor will not be a good teacher because he speaks English with an accent. But because of this belief, the student doesn't attend class regularly, does not actively listen when she attends, and then she fails the biology lab, which is like, oh, right, again, external factors. Why did this professor make me fail the lab? They weren't a good teacher. Whereas if, maybe if the student was attending lab regularly, setting away distractions. Sometimes when people speak with an accent, we have to be a little bit more focused, especially if it's an accent we're not familiar with. Everyone speaks with an accent, right? We each have our own accent we speak with. But if it's an accent we're not familiar with, we may have to focus a little bit more and pay attention. I know one woman, I forget what country she's from originally, but it's somewhere in the Pacific Islands. And in that country, they only speak English. That's the language they speak. But because she's from the Pacific Islands, right, she speaks with a different accent than a non-American accent. And she said sometimes she faces harassment and people yelling at her, why don't you speak English? And she's like, I only know English. That's the only language I know. I just speak it differently, right? I just have a different accent than you. So there are a lot of different accents that people might have. So it's important to just kind of be patient with each other. And, if someone learns multiple languages too, I mean, more power to them. I've studied Spanish for so many years. I'm still like terrible at it. So again, that's something really cool if someone speaks another language, but we may have to focus more if they're speaking an accent we're unfamiliar with. So self-fulfilling prophecies can be applied to social inequity and discrimination, but it also can be about interpersonal communication as well. So it talks here about the research has found that some people are chronically insecure about being accepted by others and feel that people dislike them. This can manifest in some behaviors that could reinforce these patterns and reinforce this false belief. So for example, this, our actions towards others, he does not engage in much conversation. Others' beliefs about us, the date's forming a negative opinion because he's not engaging in much conversation. So his date suggests they not to see each other again. And this reinforces it's an insecure person who assumes the date will not like him. So he's assuming the date's not going to like him. He doesn't engage in conversation. His date forms a negative opinion. Then they don't see each other again. And then that reinforces that cycle. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So sometimes we need to break that by just assuming, and it's hard to say, oh, I'm going to be great at this, right? That's maybe a little bit unrealistic, but just saying, hey, maybe it won't go poorly, right? Let's challenge that belief. Maybe I'm not going to be bad in this situation this time. This situation is different. Sometimes focusing on those differences can be helpful. Hey, this is a different person. It went poorly with the last person I went on a date with, but this person's different. Maybe we're going to go to a different restaurant, do something else and try it another way. And I'm a different person than I was maybe last time. I've learned some things from that interaction. Hey, I should talk more and try and engage to make the date go better, right? We can reflect on ourselves. It's hard, right? It's not necessarily an easy thing to do, but certainly we can push back against those self-destructive behaviors. So then it talks here about overcoming barriers to perceiving others. So stereotypes are sets of beliefs we develop about groups, and then we apply to individuals from that group. So there's stereotypes are schemata that are taken too far as they reduce and ignore a person's individuality and the diversity present within the larger group of people. So often with culture, there's culture, there's the large norms within that culture of how people are. I talked about being very monochronic versus polychronic. So just because polychronic time is common within Native American communities, doesn't mean everyone within that community follows polychronic time. Some Native Americans may be much more monochronic in their beliefs and how they interact with people and how they run their life, and that might be much more monochronic. So we have to be aware that there are differences, and we may have stereotypes for how someone may appear. I know right now there's a lot of uh, stuff going on in the United States regarding gender identity. The younger generations have a much higher percentage of LGBT identifying people because the younger populations are looking at gender differently, right? Instead of having just the men and women, some people are identifying as non-binary. And if we look at other cultures around the world, this either non-binary, some Native American call it two-spirited, but yeah, this definitely not necessarily that having different identities based on the culture, you may perceive things differently. I know there's some cultures in the Middle East which are very poor in terms of in terms of LGBT rights, very hostile towards and a lot of criminalizing LGBT lifestyles. But sometimes they may view transgender and gender identity and sexual orientation as different things. Right, so they're very hostile towards sexual orientation, being non-heterosexual. But in terms of gender identity, transgender, because I know I forget which culture it is in the Middle East, but it's because of there's sexism in the culture that you should have a son to kind of, pass your life down to. That if you don't have a son, your oldest daughter can live her life as a son. So again, kind of that's more of a transgender gender identity thing, which is interesting how it may be perceived and perceived in a different way. But again, lots of different cultural differences and how things can be. Some people are very much, in the United States, conservative people. You're a man, you're a woman. I can judge you based on how I see you in terms of what category you fit in. Other people, it's like, okay, this is how I externally present, may be different than I feel internally. So a lot of different things we can think about in terms of stereotypes, both positive and negative, that we may have towards people. It talks here about some Asian Americans are viewed as the model minority, and it's applied to Asian cultures. But there's a lot of diversity within the Asian American community as well. We look at some, immigrants who have come here, immigrant communities who have come here because they have money and jobs and opportunity, and other ones who are refugees within the Asian American community. There are other refugee groups who come here who don't have those same opportunities, the same support. So it's harder for them to adapt and harder for them to integrate into the mainstream culture. So whatever that may be, right? Again, how we're viewing things. So a lot of things we can talk about here in terms of stereotypes. Prejudice is specifically within stereotypes as a negative feeling or attitude towards people based on their identity. We may view them negatively. It could be conscious. It could be unconscious. We may not even know we're judging people negatively or viewing them differently because of what it may be. So it talks about having a physical disability. Certainly, it's illegal to discriminate against someone for having a physical disability in terms of hiring, in terms of many other aspects of life. But I know many people with disabilities who just say, oh, yeah, the employer assumes I can't do the job, even though I can do it, because there's some prejudice against people with disabilities, that they're not going to be as capable, even if they're given the opportunity. I know some disability rights organizations will go in there and say, hey, here are the accommodations you need. One was talking about a deaf person. If they taught other people a little bit of sign language, just a few signs, now that deaf person was able to work there and communicate with other people. They're like, oh, we never had a deaf person. I guess a deaf person can do this job, right? So sometimes we need to push back against those stereotypes, that prejudice that people may have against groups. Another way to improve our perception of other people is to engage in some self-reflection. So understanding your own biases around what we view as the norms. I think traveling abroad, if you're able to do it, is a great opportunity to understand ourselves better and reflect on ourselves and how things can be different. If you just go to touristy things, you may just deal with more American culture, but Certainly, if you push outside of that, there are ways to get yourself challenged. Even in the United States, like I said, go to a Native American reservation if you haven't already, and you may learn some things about yourself. Again, engaging in self-reflection, whether through pushing yourself in to experience another culture, or just thinking about yourself and being reflective. It may be uncomfortable because it's using these things we take for granted and some deeply held beliefs we have, and they may become less certain when we see multiple perspectives that exist, saying, hey, this isn't the only way of viewing things, right? My way is not the only way of viewing things. It's not necessarily the right way. It's just a different way, right? There's not just one right way. And I see a lot of conflict in the United States because people think my culture is right, yours is wrong. You need to agree with the way that I view things and how I perceive things. When in reality, two different things can exist without one being right and the other being wrong. But it's good for us to understand that ours is just, this is my culture, instead of this is just right. Right? Those are different ways of viewing the same thing. We can still keep it for ourselves and saying, hey, this is how I want to view the situation, while also understanding someone else can view it differently. So perception checking is a strategy to help us monitor our reactions and perceptions about people and communication. So sometimes we may check with somebody else, a trusted friend, a colleague, saying, hey, am I misperceiving this right now? Am I just being sensitive, or wasn't he acting a little bit weird? And like, oh no, he seemed normal to me. Okay, well, again, so those perception checking, just using checking in with somebody else can be very helpful. We can also check our own perception, like asking ourselves question, what is influencing the perceptions I'm making right now, right? What factors may be at play? So you can ask somebody else, which is, I think, the easiest way and best way to do it, because sometimes it's hard to understand what's impacting our own perception. But also just, we can do some checking ourselves too. So that's a bit about the perception process. Again, I'm running through a variety of different things. But perception is how we view ourselves, how we view other people, how we view these interactions. If we go back to the beginning here, it talks about the selection, organization, and interpreting process of perception, and then talked a lot about how we're perceiving ourselves, how we're perceiving other people within those communication interactions. Right, culture is a big thing here when it comes to perception, our own culture and the culture of other people, and how we may perceive things as normal or abnormal based on those backgrounds. But the more we can check our perception, the more we can start understanding, hey, this is just my perception based on my background, based on my experiences of life, based on my experiences in this setting, this situation. Just because it's true to me doesn't mean it's true to somebody else. And just because two people witness the exact same thing, right? You can witness it together, you may interpret it differently. You may select different information, you may organize it differently, you may interpret it differently at any of those stages. So sometimes that's where a conflict comes into account. And so, I would recommend that if you're in conflict with someone else, you take a step back and say, hey, why is this person interpreting in this other way? Right? We have that self-serving bias. We have the fundamental attribution error. So things to take into account that we may be nicer to ourselves, than we are to other people. But taking our time to reflect on all these things can help us be a better communicator and be better at perceiving others. So I hope you found this textbook lecture helpful. It has a lot of great information in here. And I'll continue with the lectures on the other chapters as well. So thank you for your participation. Thank you for listening. And always feel free to reach out if you have any questions or any clarifications that I can make on this material. Take care.